Following the defeat of Japan in World War II, their colonies and puppet states were returned or occupied to the Allied powers, one of which was Korea, which was divided along the 30th parallel between the Soviet Union and the United States, who both placed ideologically opposing dictators on their sides of the peninsula. To the north was Kim Il-sung, grandfather to the current dictator Kim Jong-un, who controls one of the most brutal regimes in the world. But what if this wasn't the case? This is Syrup Dog Studios presenting What If the Kims Were Deposed? Kim Il-sung took power as the leader of North Korea following the Soviet-sponsored 1948 North Korean parliamentary election. The Soviets and the rest of the communist world quickly recognized North Korea as a legitimate Korea, and not the US allied South Korea. Then, after a breakdown of negotiations to reunite Korea, Kim declared war on the South, but was later pushed back by the US-led UN force that led all the way to the Chinese border, where the Chinese then intervened on the side of Kim, resulting in the Armed Justice Line being the border between the two countries. Although Kim did not capture the South, he declared it as a victory and began to overhaul the reconstruction of the nation after the war through means of industry, collectivized agriculture, and the elimination of rivals. This left many within the Workers' Party of North Korea, the dominant and successor to the Workers' Party of Korea, split on his ideas, and the already pre-existing factions becoming more divided, for which there were four, but I'll also include the two other political parties allowed in the country at this time. The Soviet faction were members of the party who were Koryosami, Koreans who were born in the Soviet Union, or people who were against the Kim family's cult of personality, and are anti-Stalinist. Some may say revisionist and are tied to Khrushchev in the USSR, for which they were mostly supported through. The Yan'an faction were members of the party who fled to China during World War II and were supported by the Chinese Communist Party, who were in Mao Zedong's sphere of influence. Many of the members had fought alongside the Chinese in World War II and were now marshals or generals in the North Korean army. This faction was led by Kim Il-sung directly and was the only one not to be purged. It focused on high military spending and anti-revisionism, going against calls for the establishment of the Kim cult of personality, and are the most evil and corrupt of the factions. Also, there was also a split in this faction called the Kapsun faction. The Kapsun faction emerged later after the purges of the other factions and criticized the economic policies that focused on the military rather than on the nation, encouraging light industries such as farming and consumer goods rather than mining and factories. Also, another key issue was the successor of Kim Il-sung, which at this time seemed to be his brother, Kim Yong-ju, and wanted the successor to be their leader, Pak Kum-chol. The domestic faction was much more like the guerrilla faction, for they had not left the Korean peninsula and continued the fight against the Japanese during World War II, although they were connected to the old leadership of the South Korean Communist Party and were not supported by the USSR or China. The party was first created by merchants and upper-class Christians in Korea, but was later infiltrated by the communist Cho Yong-gon, who was headed by the Presbyterian minister Kang Rang-yeok, a part of the Christian Federation. The Chandoist Changgu Party is a North Korean religious party and closely tied to the Korean independence movement as an alternative to Christian missionaries at this time. It was led by Kim Tae-hyun, for which I could not find any photographs of this man. However, after the purge, it was believed that he died. The party was closely tied to the religious movement in Seoul, and at this time was not supported by either the Chinese or the Soviets. There were 98,000 members in North Korea at this time. Meanwhile, in the USSR, Stalin was replaced with Khrushchev, who began to reform the Eastern Bloc and other countries into dishing heavy authoritarianism, cults of personalities, censorship, and cultural liberalization, which is exactly what Kim Il-sung was against as an anti-revisionist. The Yan'an faction and the Soviet faction attempted to defame and replace Kim Il-sung on August 30th, 1956, which ultimately failed and the party was purged. But in this timeline, the Chinese and Soviets intervened. Following the speech denouncing Kim Il-sung, the Propaganda and Agitation Department, which would have had an internal coup in itself, as it had ties to the Yan'an faction, would begin to print leaflets attacking Kim Il-sung and his failed policies. Meanwhile, in the military, the 5th and 1st Corps would occupy Pyongyang. Outside of North Korea, Mao Zedong would begin to coordinate the CPV on the border. By the next day, the coup had seceded and the Kims were removed from power. But now what? The coup's power vacuum would lead to two divergent timelines, both of which I'll be covering in this video, but it did start out something like this. Government positions once filled by the guerrilla faction would be quickly filled in by the Yan'an faction and the Soviet faction, and the head of state, which would be the chairman of the Central Committee of the Workers' Party of Korea, would be filled in by a troika. A troika is a temporary head of government in far-left countries, and is basically a group of 3 or more people who all share the same amount of power, although historically they are discontinued after a power grab. The troika would be made up of Pak Chong-ai, Cho Chang-ik, and Pak Han-yong, of the 3 most influential factions, and through various means we can see the Yan'an faction take power. As this happens, the Sino-Soviet split begins, and Mao Zedong's China becomes anti-revisionist and opposes the Khrushchevist Soviet Union, where in this timeline, North Korea sides with China, making the Sino-Soviet border conflict occur earlier than in our timeline. Later in the 60s, Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution would kill millions inside China, with famines and the Red Guards taking most of them. The effects of this would also spill over into North Korea, with the Socialist Patriotic Youth League taking over, led by Cho Yong-gon. The Soviet Union's response would either to be intervene, much like in the Prague Spring, with the Brezhnev Doctrine, being a Soviet invasion and restoration of power to a pro-Soviet government. If this were to happen, though, tensions between the Soviet Union and China would be extremely high and would open a third front in the Cold War. By the 1970s and 80s, Cho Yong-gon would be replaced by a member of the Kapsan faction. I cannot say which, as it's likely there would have been a purge, and many of the leaders would have been imprisoned due to their ideology against Shogun and a focus on agriculture industry. Deng Xiaoping of China would then allocate them into power. After the fall of the USSR and China becoming what it is today, it's likely North Korea would be a Chinese puppet, or be completely integrated into the Yambanian Korean Autonomous Prefecture, where reunification with the South would still be off the table. As I said before, a troika would be set up, except that the Soviet Korean faction would take control of the government. Whereupon taking power, the military spending would drop and would be funneled into public works projects and agriculture, dropping the whole Stalinist policy thing like in our timeline. When the Sino-Soviet split occurs, North Korea would have sided with the Soviet Union, and when the Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward fail, North Korea would begin to criticize the effects of the situation, especially in the Korean-speaking areas of Manchuria, almost being left-wing nationalism. Along with this, Kurosami would begin to move back from the USSR to North Korea, effects of which would be an influx of workers to operate heavy industry, which by then would totally be running. By the 1970s, the Kapsan faction and domestic faction would take power, installing Pak Geun-hye as leader of North Korea, who would drastically liberalize the country economically, religiously, diplomatically, and internally. Protestantism, Presbyterianism, and Chodaism would gain more traction, and by the 1980s, when the Soviet Union would begin to lose its grip on the Eastern Bloc, North Korea would unite with the South.